All right. Oh, wow. Booming, echoing voice. I like that. Okay, thank you all for coming to There and Back Again. Before I get started, I just want to disabuse you of the idea that this is in any way, shape, or form oriented around The Hobbit. I realize that There and Back Again is a blatant ripoff of that of the entire book, and the reason I'm using it for a title is because I stole it. And there's a quote that I found that I really liked because it justified this openly, so I stole that too. So, who am I and why am I qualified to do this? I was a Salt contributor way back in the early days. If we look back into the mists of time, I was the 15th contributor way back when. Obviously, standards were non-existent back then. I was the Ubuntu packager originally, and I also wound up contributing a few bits of code here and there. I've been working with configuration management for a very long time. I took a stint last summer as a traveling trainer for Puppet Labs, so I tend to be a little bit all over the map, and I have some interesting ideas around the entire space. When I'm not dealing hands-on with configuration management, I'm closely related to it. I spend a fair bit of time DevOpsing in the cloud, which is the only job description I'll admit to these days. I wound up getting I was the 7th person to pass the SaltStack Certified Engineer exam last year, back when it was a little buggier than it is today. And today I want to take a subtle and nuanced position that is non-controversial. And to be fair, you have absolutely no one to blame but yourselves. When Rhett, the VP of Marketing, asked me to give this talk, he saw a talk that I gave about 2 weeks ago at the Scale conference in Los Angeles. And it was a 5-minute lightning talk with slides auto-advancing in which I compared various DevOps type experiences with drinking different types of whiskey. And he thought this would be fantastic. You should do a 45-minute talk like that. The challenge is if I stand up here and I talk for 45 minutes about my drinking habits, someone's going to stage an intervention by the end of the conference. So that wasn't really the direction I wanted this to go in. So, I'm sorry?
I'll just buy you some. It'll be more entertaining.
So let's talk about Salt. Actually, before we do that, let's talk about remote execution back in the day. I'm not necessarily convinced you need Salt because I have the perfect tool for this. Does anyone remember cluster SSH? Perfect. For those who are unaware, it was a great utility, still maintained, that you fire it up, it establishes an SSH session to a bunch of different hosts. And it provides you a master command window. Anything you type in there gets multiplexed out to all of your hosts, and you see feedback in real time. And it's awesome, and it's amazing, and we don't need Salt. So in my first Unix job, I ran this in production. Can anyone spot the problem here? Exactly. What I wanted to do was that. Note the double bracket as opposed to the single bracket. So that was an interesting experience across the entire FreeBSD infrastructure. And yes, I did start my career as a BSD administrator before I was fired for being unable to grow a proper beard. So I've just overwritten this file, and I pretty much have one response, whoops-a-daisy. So I go and talk to my boss, and I get that wonderful little blurb of, oh, well, fortunately, you can restore from backups, right? It was an interesting learning experience, and I wound up spending the next 2 days of painstakingly recreating this by hand in order to make sure that things wound up the way they should be, and hoping the entire time that there wasn't going to be an unexpected power outage. But I eventually managed to get everything back. So this led me to the idea that maybe remote execution by itself isn't enough to manage systems at scale. And before you start pointing fingers and laughing at the fact that, well, it's a cluster SSH problem, it's not that different from a Salt command. It also helps to wind up nailing the proper angle bracket. So this is not that far removed from the early ways that a number of us started using Salt. You just run various commands with no fallback and hope for the best. This isn't really an ideal. So that's where the idea of configuration management starts to come back in and play a bit differently. So now that we wind up debunking the idea of remote execution, let's start talking about configuration management a bit. And The modern era of config management all started with CF Engine. And I know someone in here is probably thinking, well, what about bconfig? Yes, you're right, there were earlier solutions. Shouldn't you be off writing Perl somewhere? The problem is that you had to know what system you were on. If you wanted CF Engine to install a package, you had to be extremely explicit as far as what that syntax looked like, what type of package management system was in place, and it wound up being relatively unfortunate. Puppet came out and then started focusing on building across some of the improvements that CF Engine was sorely lacking. One of their big advances was the resource abstraction layer. I can tell Puppet to go ahead and make sure a certain package is installed, and I don't have to think about exactly what package provider is under the hood. Is it yum? Is it apt? Is it something else? I don't have to care. And Puppet made some interesting design decisions, and to this day, they are the last man standing in the idea of having states being lexicographically non-deterministic. And what that means, effectively, and this is probably the only slide in this entire conference that has Puppet code on it, but we're going to roll with it. You'll notice here it's relatively straightforward. We're installing a package, we are making sure that there's a file in place on disk, and we're ensuring that a service is starting. And if you put this into a Puppet class, there is absolutely no way to guarantee which order these things are going to run in. So every time you wind up putting something like this in, you have to put in explicit ordering statements. Subscribe a service to a file, require a package before you manage a file, and so on and so forth. And they actually are affecting this now with the idea that, well, enough people have complained about this. We're going to, in the early development version, they called it chef mode. You could put in -- chef mode and it would do manifest ordering. They realized, wow, people really like this, so we're going to go ahead and actually call it manifest ordering in a release, which they did, and I applaud them for this if it worked, but there's still some teething issues with it. Now, to be fair, Salt originally started out the same way before realizing back in 0.17 that this was ridiculous and you should actually maybe try applying things in the order they're written. You can override that with explicit ordering statements, but by and large, it pretty much does what you expect when you look at it. Chef also went a different direction. They wound up forking away from Puppet way back in the early days, and it did some really interesting approaches to this. And it has some great advantages to it. And please don't think this is in any way an insult to them, but it's written in Ruby. In fact, Chef has often been called a library that you can call within Ruby. And that's fine, and it's powerful, and it opens up a lot of opportunity. But as a counterpoint, you often wind up in a scenario where, okay, every one of our sysadmins needs to also be a qualified Ruby developer. That can be a big ask in a lot of places, not to mention the fact that those people can be pants-wettingly expensive. So now, here we are at 16 slides in. Let's start talking about Salt. Can you raise your hand if you've heard of it before? Hey, there we are. If you haven't, you're probably looking for the real estate conference down the hall, a bunch of people dressed like me. And Salt is not about configuration management. And that used to be a bit of a strange statement. It's becoming more accepted. But let's get onto it. Let's get into it a little bit more. Specifically, that in a DevOps context, I consider configuration management to be an application that's written on top of the Salt platform. And I think to picture Salt as a configuration management system is short-sighted, and increasingly, if you hold on to that viewpoint, a lot of the direction that Salt is moving in and things that it's enabling aren't going to make a whole lot of conceptual sense. In fact, I would say that there are four things I want to call out here that wind up differentiating Salt. The first is the event reactor subsystem. It's common in many configuration management systems to restart a service when a file changes. This is simple, this is straightforward, everything back to CF Engine and before can do it. Where it gets really sticky is when you have that service and that file living on two different boxes. At that point, you wind up with all kinds of internode signaling problems that Salt handles extremely well and effectively with the event reactor. Tied to this, but not completely related, is the idea of the peer-published subsystem. I'll talk about this a little later on, but you might want to have your monitoring system drop a question onto the Salt bus. Without peer-publish, that means that you've got to have your monitoring system living on the master. Now, I'm kind of bold when it comes to operational strategy, but I generally tend to avoid putting a web UI written in something ancient on the box that has root everywhere in real time. It just seems like a bad idea. So the peer-publish system gets around that. The Salt API also lets you leverage this for custom in-house applications. The idea being that you can treat Salt almost like it's its own socket library, where you can drop messages to other nodes and abstract the communications overhead away. Additionally, it tends to give you a very useful bus between all of your systems that doesn't have to step through nearly as many things that, say, SSHing into does. If you can get clearance for Salt, you don't have to put a change request through your firewall folks, for example. And the last thing that it likes to do is solves the push or pull question. And I brought this up in a variety of contexts in a number of different talks I've given, where is push or is pull better? The argument in favor of push is that you've just dragged me into HR to have a meeting, and I'm being told my services are no longer required, probably due to something related to drinking. And in about 45 seconds, I'm coming storming out of that office with a giant chip on my shoulder, and I have root across 4,500 systems. How do you wind up pushing out the revocation of my user account in that context? If you wait for pull, it's not likely to work very well. The counterpoint is I have a system. It's been down for 2 weeks. If you're just doing pushes out even across the Salt bus, while that system is down, it's not going to be caching and then applying those commands when it comes back up. How do I prevent my system from coming up running old code in my environment? Depending on the change, that could be very destructive. So the answer to that question, as I see it in a Salt context, is both. You can do push and pull, and I've leveraged both of those in various environments. Now, this ties into also what I'm going to do a different talk on this one of these days, the 4 horsemen of DevOps, which ties into the question of what exactly is DevOps. And I can't tell you that because none of you are paying my bill rate at the moment. But I assure you, it's awesome. And as I see it, it breaks down into 4 real pieces that you need, all of which Salt provides in different ways. You have the configuration management piece, which we've beaten the greasy spot on the pavement where the dead horse used to be. We've done remote execution, in other words, firing things off to orchestrate a self-aware cluster, which is convenient. We have the provisioning piece. In other words, how do I wind up spinning up new instances in my environment? Be those virtual machines, be they physical hardware, be they containers. It doesn't really matter. Salt has answers for all of these things. And the last piece that people are just starting to wrap their heads around is the idea of service discovery. Hypothetically, you have a web server that comes online. How does it let the load balancer know, I'm a web server, I'm online, go ahead and send traffic to me? Salt's answer to this is the Salt Mine. Other places leverage Zookeeper, some places are looking into Console, but this is an increased area of focus for any significantly large environments. And in order to do any kind of auto-scaling in the true sense, as opposed to Amazon's platform offering of the same name, it's helpful to have something that's a bit more agnostic. And I would argue that Salt tends to deliver on that relatively well. And there is one more big difference that Salt has that differentiates it from other offerings in this space. I would argue it's the most important, and that turns into the community that's built around it. Personally, I found it relatively easy for me to approach this. It was about 4 years ago, back when Salt was first launching, and I'd done a handful of Puppet environments. This was back in the 0.24 days of Puppet, which if you talk to their CEO, he will generally buy you a drink to apologize because it was that bad. We all start off in some interesting places. And I wanted to do something different. So I approached the community, and such as it was at the time, and there were some challenges there. There were features that were missing. There wasn't a Ubuntu package available, and I was in a Ubuntu environment at the time. And I was invited to contribute. Now, this may come across as shocking. I know the suit often gives people a false positive, but I'm not a software developer, believe it or not. So when I called this out, the response was generally, well, so what? Learn. Worst case, you break something, and according to you, it's broken anyway, so go ahead and do it. It was, right? Oh, both? You think I only broke it in half? I shattered it. No, it was fun. And building this stuff out was a learning experience. It was eye-opening, and it gave me a rather unique insight into what it's like to contribute. At the time, I was helping to run the Freenode IRC network, which I did on and off for about 5 years. And so I have some exposure to a lot of different open source communities. For instance, when there was no Ubuntu package, I went out and figured it was time to build this. Now, does anyone have any experience packaging for Debian or its derivatives? A couple people looking humiliated. Yeah. For those who aren't aware, the way you do this is you go online and you read the documentation, which references 3 discrete ways of building Debian packages. Then you wind up trying to piece something together, and then you wind up asking the Debian community, at which point they call you a moron, tell you to read the manual, and you're holding it wrong. So it turns into an iterative cycle, and that's fairly typical for many open source projects. The challenge is that then I went back to Salt and got some guidance from people who've been doing this longer. And the real trick to building a Debian package is to get something that installs off the ground and then show it to a Debian developer. At which point they say, this is awful, don't ever do this again. You know what, just move, I'll handle this. And that's how you find a packager. And it was fun, but that is a somewhat typical experience in many communities. The fact that it wasn't within Salt was eye-opening, and that is unmatched in any open source project I've ever heard of. I'll stop naming names. So I want to talk a little bit about the way that Salt used to be. And I know it sounds crazy, but we have been out there long enough now in the market that there are actual legacy environments that are broken. And walking into them and seeing, ooh, when's the last time you updated this? Well, you know what your problem is. And it falls on from there. For example, does anyone remember the days back when Salt couldn't update itself?
You've got changes like every point.
Uh-huh.
Something 16 to 17. Oh, you wanted that salt steak?
Whoops-a-daisy. Exactly. And as again, as a Ubuntu packager, it's, well, okay, so it starts to update itself and then kills itself midway through the update, and now my package database is in an inconsistent state everywhere. So now I'm iterating through boxes, fixing these things, and hoping that again, keeping all of the pieces that I have shattered around there. And it was kind of crappy and terrifying, and updates used to be a giant, massive project. In fact, in one shop, I wound up installing Puppet to update Salt, and then use Salt to update Puppet. And now we're going in circles, and what's wrong with me? And there's a panel on this tomorrow afternoon. This is also a fun one that tends to come and go. Anyone ever seen this one before? Where you send out a command and some things come back and not everything does? This used to be a problem before you could get viable reporting data out of it. Like, well, you know, that is not an idempotent command, so I don't really want to run it a second time. But if I don't, I'm not going to be able to continue in my deployment. Now I have to log in individually and make sure it works. This was an interesting problem. And most of these bugs have now been resolved in recent versions. I'm told, maybe Dave can confirm, that it was a display issue and a challenge with the way that 0MQ was interfacing, not actually a problem with the bus.
Yeah. Okay. 99% of the time, if you went and looked at the job cache, you would see all the results there.
Yeah.
They weren't showing up on the command line.
Yeah, as I recall, the job cache wasn't always directly accessible either, which was sort of eye-opening as far as, oh, I can actually get reporting data. What an amazing concept. This is another one that I found sort of awesome. The idea being that Pillar would render data individually per minion, which means you can wind up stuffing things you don't want public. For example, private keys or password data. The reason that this is important is that historically, every minion can walk the file server, which it still can do. So you wind up getting access to everything if you just store them as standard files if you breach one minion. I'm not a big fan of a security posture of once I've taken over one system, I've taken over all of them, which is why Pillar was important. I was in one environment where they recognized this. So what they decided that they were going to do was build out a database on the master that would serve custom grains. So every time that they did a high state on a minion, it would make a database call back to the master. which worked really, really well when you had a dozen nodes. When you have several hundred, it winds up catching fire and falling over, which was really kind of impressive because you've taken a highly available, highly scalable system and made it fall over under load. I didn't realize you could do that. That's kind of amazing.
Single points of failure are fun.
Exactly. No, it was fun, and it was a bit of an interesting challenge, but being able to go into that environment, you have two choices. We can retrofit all of these custom grains with Pillar, or we can just use the batch flag on Salt and only do so many at a time. It really depends on what they wanted to do. There was also an interesting time where I was bored one weekend. So I wound up replacing check NRPE on my nagios box with a peer publish approach, which it would drop a query onto the bus, ask checkmk across the rest of the nodes where things were in a monitoring sense, and then populate the nagios database with those responses that came back. It worked well because instead of taking 5 minutes to query everything, it now took about 15 seconds. So this was awesome, and I wound up doing a fair bit of monitoring on this and then called it good. And then I got paged that a host was timing out. And then it recovered. And then I got paged that another host was timing out, and it recovered. So I did according to my best practices talk last year, I did what you're supposed to do in these situations, which is to blame Dave. So I wound up opening a bug on this, and Tom said, well, let me see what I can do. And then he didn't respond for 18 hours, which, if you know Tom's response time, means that he's dead. And then he says, all right, I think I fixed it. Try this patch. And OK, I'll apply this patch. And good God, it's 500 lines. What did you do? Oh, I rewrote the entire peer publish subsystem. It's better now. And yes, it was better. And that guy is terrifying. This is another interesting one. In the early days, the grains data that would be spit out across OS X was horribly broken because it didn't conform to the reference platform that Salt is developed for, which is, of course, Arch Linux because Utah. So when you wind up running this, I thought it was FreeBSD in some cases. So at one of the Salt sprints, I wound up sitting down and helping to flesh out the core grains file. And yesterday, as I was putting this together, I did a quick git blame. And do you realize that there are 66 lines of my code still there? That's a bug. There needs to be an issue opened on this. So now is one of my favorite parts of this conversation, where I'm going to give SaltStack, since we have a couple of their employees in the room, some feedback as far as what I think they can do better. It's always great to start conversations like this with, you know what your problem is, especially when you're talking to your boss, because that usually means, hi, I'm heavily intoxicated. Please disregard everything I'm about to say. Now, I originally thought that Salt could use a fun mascot, but then I realized that I was out of date, because we already have one. The problem is that this goofy bastard does a poor job of it. I'm serious. I've seen you at 6 conferences now across 2 continents, and you're always there. Can we just replace you with like a salty sea dog or something? None of the config management companies have any kind of mascot. We should be the first. Something fun, something furry.
And he still shares Twilio APIs.
See? There's another problem that really, really, really needs to be addressed. If you wind up looking at other large notable open source projects and look at, for example, Linux kernel mailing list, you notice that Linus tends to have a certain way about him, where he sends an email to someone, and you read the email, where you can tell it's probably the 3rd draft. The first draft was actively hoping the person who wrote the patch dies. The second is suggesting that they die, and the third one is just questioning their competence to touch a computer. And that's the one that gets sent. And I tried to juxtapose this in my mind as picturing Tom Hatch flaming someone. And I really couldn't do it, because I'm picturing this as he sits down when some well-meaning moron submits something stupid or insults someone on the mailing list. I can just picture him in his basement, middle of the night after a warm glass of milk or something, and he's sitting down. oh, bless your heart. And that's about as mean as Tom gets. It's really ruining his credibility in this space. And I don't think he's going to be taken seriously until he just tears some well-meaning moron to pieces, and I volunteer to be that moron. One other thing that I've noticed lately is over the past 6 months, I've been doing an extortionate amount of testing around various configuration management tools. And a lot of other tools have great test frameworks. We're talking RSpec. Chef is apparently doing Test Kitchen, which they're now making available for other things up to and including Salt. And it was weird and it was creepy, and ever since I started using it, I can't go back. It's an idea of, all right, here's my list of configuration. What the test suite does is it automatically, and this can be triggered by Jenkins or similar, spins up a series of VMs. It winds up instantiating different roles for different VMs, applying various configuration, and looking for known results, and then generates a report that spits that out. This is an awesome idea. I would love to see this embraced by the general Salt community. Every time that I wind up playing in this space, I feel like I've gone a little bit off the deep end, and I'm sort of going into untread territory. I would love a best practices around testing and some formalized way of doing this. Because I'll be blunt, I'm getting very tired of pushing the deploy button and cringing to see what explodes. One other thing that I'd like to see specifically is a better idea for me personally of what the Salt business plan is. I understand right now they sell licenses for SaltStack Enterprise. It does well. It opens up opportunities. But who here works with Salt on a day-to-day basis? A fair number of people. All right, second question. Who here is authorized to sign a 7-figure check? Anyone? Because if so, I'd love to talk about my bill rate. There we go. The problem is this, as I've mentioned, one of the best things about Salt is its overwhelming community support. The challenge is it's difficult for me today to make a strong and compelling argument to management to go ahead and buy SaltStack Enterprise or any enterprise version of any configuration management system because of how it's been positioned in the past. It's very expensive, and generally one of the compelling reasons is you get official support, which if you use that as a sales pitch, it's not too far of a stretch to turn this into a, well, shucks, I'm not very good at computering, so maybe we should throw money at someone else who is. It's difficult to make the argument without sort of cutting yourself off at the knees. I am told there are interesting things in the works, and I've heard about 5 different takes on it so far this week, but I have yet to hear a compelling story around this that the community can get behind. There is such a tremendous amount of goodwill in the community. I have to think there's a way to leverage this to actually make money.
But you can go back to your idea of making Tom Hatch mean, and you can make everybody mean, and then it's less, I'm not good at computering anymore. That's a real nice system you got. It'd be a shame if something happened to it.
Gotcha. Yes, we call it the nagios model. Yeah, and the last thing that I want to talk about here, and that Salt should look at with an eye to the future, is not to lose the magic that we have here. And to use a personal example here, Craig started playing with SaltStack today. And earlier this afternoon, yesterday, my apologies, good Lord. And this afternoon, he was answering correctly, and I believe I was shocked as anyone, some questions posed by one of our security consultants around, is Salt actually usable in a secured environment that has to answer to PCI? The answer, of course, is yes, banks use it, but it was nice to see someone who had just started understanding how that works. It is, without question, the most user-friendly, approachable system that I've ever found for this. One of the things I do as a consultant is I interview other prospective consultants, and there's increasingly a divide in this space where you'll talk to someone who's been working as a systems administrator for 20 years. And they don't have 20 years of experience. They have 1 year of experience repeated 20 times. And they're still acting like the same systems administrator they were 2 decades ago. Well, that's great, but we're rapidly spinning up environments faster than you can manage them by hand. If you're not getting on board with a configuration management system or the other things that are attendant with that, in either now or in the relatively near future, I'm afraid you're missing the boat. And it's important from my perspective to be able to embrace that in a meaningful way. I think that Salt's community and technology have always been extremely accessible. I would just caution that as it continues to get more involved and more featureful, that we still retain that simplicity and approachability that means you don't have to go and sit through 3 weeks of classes to do something effective with it. I'd like to thank you all for your time. Yeah.
Corey,
Question?
if you want any back history on Corey, things he doesn't want you to know, I'm happy to answer those. We've been working together for a while.
No, are there any questions? I'm thrilled to answer them if so. Comments, feedback?
Where does your Twitter handle come from?
I like puns, and using my last name in them is sort of ideal. Quinny Pig. Well, it used to be my ham radio call sign, but no one could remember or pronounce it, so I figured I'd go with something a little bit more approachable. I know, you're a fan. You can even use it as a mascot if you'd like. Yes?
So I work for Salt, and I'm new. I started on Monday,
Okay.
and so I've been drinking the Salt Kool-Aid.
I'd be drinking something stronger than that, but welcome aboard.
My question being, your straightforward nature. I noticed on LinkedIn that you were a technical trainer for Puppet some time ago.
Yes, last summer.
And in my short time period with the company, everyone tells me how far superior Salt is to Puppet.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what your, having worked at Puppet, understanding Salt,
Mm-hmm.
if you could help me understand your thoughts.
Sure. I would argue from a starting point that they're trying to solve two different problems. I think that to do a direct heads-to-heads comparison is to equate Salt as a configuration management system, which is really what it rose to prominence on, but as I mentioned, is something of a severely limiting view of it. The idea is you now have a full-fledged message bus between all of your nodes across multiple data centers. That's an extremely powerful thing to leverage. As far as pure configuration management goes, Puppet has its strengths and its weaknesses. Salt obviously came along far after Puppet was created, so it's not necessarily fair to say, oh, well, Salt is better in this respect, just because we all stand on the shoulders of giants. I would argue that Salt did some things better than Puppet did architecturally, in the same way that Puppet did things better architecture than CF Engine did, just because we all try to improve upon what came before. There are things, for example, testing, that I think Puppet at the moment spanks Salt in. There are also other things, for example, how do I figure out what order this stuff is going to apply in that I think Salt is far superior in. So it really comes down to a position of what is the problem you're trying to solve. Something else I want to point out is if you are just approaching this from a configuration management perspective, over 80% of businesses out there are not using any configuration management that we would recognize. There's something internal that they have developed that they are working on. That is not the way to do it. If you've got a fully baked working environment using one system, I'd be hard-pressed to advocate for ripping the whole thing out and replacing it with something else. I understand people do it, sometimes to gain ancillary benefits, but I don't think that that's necessarily a requirement. For example, I was consulting at one shop. It was a heavy Chef environment. Do I think that they should rip out Chef and replace it with Salt? Not really, because you already have 50 engineers there who are very conversant with Chef. I think that, by the way, time for everyone to learn something new. We're replacing this thing that's been working well for years. There's no value in that. It creates a fair bit of work. I also would like to see going forward a bit of a divergence from people hitting the Python side of Salt as strongly as they are. There are compelling reasons to use Nginx, but I don't think I've ever heard someone advocate for using it because it's written in C. I think that we're going to approach something very similar in the context of configuration management. I think down the road, the idea of doing language bindings for example, Ruby as an example, or Go for Salt would be a definite win. Originally, a lot of the technologies underlying it, such as ZeroMQ and MessagePack, were done to be platform agnostic. And I'd like to see further development work done in that space if I'm wishing for things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's some good insight. Thank you.
Awesome, of course.
Can you repeat what the original question was?
Oh, sorry, the original question was, Since I tend to be direct, could I go ahead and give a head-to-head comparison between Puppet and Salt, having extensive experience with both, without getting myself sued?
The other difference is documentation. Salt's documentation is great, but you compare Puppet's. I recently went through the Puppet.
Mm-hmm.
It's a night and day difference.
Yes.
Puppet, you get a poster and a VM and this huge book, where Salt's sort of the pop one up in the docs, you pop up in the code and go, oh. But if you're not that kind of
Yes.
person, you're drowning.
Absolutely. There is a strong documentation difference, but it's also important to remember that Puppet has been formed as a company as Reductive Labs, I believe back in 2004. And they're also 6 times the size of SaltStack, last I checked. So it's, when you have an entire documentation team dedicated to putting this stuff together, you add a timeline in which to do it, it's a lot easier to come up with stuff.
And an education team.
Yes.
And a professional services team.
Yes.
They've been around, Corey's right. But there's a great question going back to what you just said and to what you were asking. If you want to know Corey's true feelings on the Puppet stuff, get me this evening, because I was the other trainer on that project, and I can tell you what he told me.
I plan on it.
Salt's got a doc guy now.
We just hired like a month ago, a fantastic documentation expert.
Wonderful.
From Adobe.
Wonderful.
He's already made fantastic improvements on things, and he'll be working with docs.
Perfect.
We definitely know that's a weakness.
To be fair, there are ameliorating ways around this. They have a thriving community. You can ask dumb questions all day long on IRC or the mailing list, which is what I do. When I see a new feature, I don't even read the documentation. I just ask Dave.
Yeah, that one's,
Well, not with that attitude. Yes.
So, I'm curious what your given your recommendations for Salt for improvement, what are your recommendations for the community?
That's a great question. The question was, what are my recommendations for the community? How can we improve? I would argue that the biggest challenge the community faces is not one of how do we get better, it's how do we avoid becoming worse. And it's very easy for people who become immersed in a technology to forget what it's like to be new and be struggling with the basic concepts. I wound up talking to a number of people from other companies who are embedded deeply in this stuff, and I said, yes, I'm learning some things about your system from beginner's perspective. How can I approach that? He's like, I have no idea. I have no time for you. Go talk to someone else about this. Which was a fair answer, but I also think he's a jerk as a result. So it's one of those. There's always been a strong ethos in the Salt community of don't be an asshole, and I would argue that it's important to continue to maintain that. Continue to be welcoming and friendly to people. When people do things that are ill-advised, remember that we've all been there and done that. For example, blowing away a FreeBSD environment. It's best to remember that we're all learning new things every day. And the trick is not just how do you help someone with their problem, but how do you make them want to stick around? To the point where once they understand this, that they're giving back to the community and helping other people along and learn how this stuff works. Does that answer your question? Perfect. Were there any other questions? I hear laughter in the hallways, which means it's probably happy hour. Oh, please. Oh, please.
So, out in New York, startup culture seems to be very, very Ansible focused.
Yes.
What can people in the community, what can SaltStack do to be defensive, to increase mindshare?
Great question. It was Ansible's on the rise. How can the SaltStack community be defensive against that? And I would argue that it doesn't need to be, and here's why. Ansible is an interesting idea in that you have is effectively an SSH parallelizer. It is a nicer version of cluster SSH in many respects, but that is the architecture that it's built upon. It is designed to do that one thing and do it well. Salt SSH is a counterpoint to that, and that effectively works in many respects in the same way. But ultimately, if you're starting off as being an SSH parallelizer, I'm somewhat unconvinced that you can go from there to massive multi-site orchestration, having things like the event reactor system, doing things such as peer publish. I don't think that there's necessarily a great answer there. I'm also somewhat skeptical around the idea of having systems communicate in automated fashion over SSH as a transport. It's heavy and it's not designed for efficient communication. That's why we use a serialization protocol inside of 0MQ or in RAID for those of us who are living in the future. Yes, very much so.
Right. Well, And those are all points I agree with, but
Mhm.
I think specifically because what I was noting was startup culture
Mhm.
is very invested.
Yes.
And that's, once you have that set configuration management system, you've built a lot of your thing, and you start
Yes.
to grow your system, you're not going to switch exactly as you
Mhm.
do it.
Right.
So how do we get people when they don't care about 10,000 words? How do we get people when they don't care about more than 10?
Right. I would argue the answer to that, the question, how do you wind up in the small startups that have 10 nodes, how do you wind up instituting this idea? I'm not sure you're going to catch every startup because Ansible is extremely approachable. Because if you're a developer and you don't have an operational background, well, how do you log in and affect code changes on your system? Well, I SSH into it. So now I have a system that does exactly that. What Salt could do, if it wants to be a bit more defensive in that area, is build itself so that it can take Ansible playbooks and do either a one-off or a real-time translation into a state file so that you wind up effectively achieving the same thing. I know that we also are, for example, we have a Puppet module now that will actually run Puppet when you wind up across the bus, which is an interesting way of handling a masterless Puppet environment. And I think we're starting to see integration and cross-contamination around these things. I still think that it is such an open field that, to be blunt, when I see an Ansible shop, I'm just happy that someone's using something that isn't something they developed in-house. Yeah. Craig,
Can I add on to that?
please do.
So I've recently, still currently, I'm going through that exact process. I support multiple products at Adobe that are mostly acquisitions. We have one team that has been using Ansible for a while. The larger organization wants to go with Salt. There's a heavy Puppet infrastructure. The Ansible guy is the most noisy, and they ask that same question, why should I even bother? If you can't get through the point that, I understand that in a startup environment, you just need to solve the problem right now, and that's great. But there's no harm in looking forward to the future as well. And the 4 points that Corey pointed out as being key differences to Salt, the event bus, reactors, returners. When I explained that to the Ansible guys and said, that's why, because this will also, I can use this bus to do monitoring, to do notifications and alerting and all that, that is what made the difference to them. Because now they saw that it's, okay, I've got some investment in Ansible, but this also opens up and solves all these other problems that are just waiting for me to solve them. So that did help. That's just one idea.
Perfect. Any other comments, questions, concerns, heckling? Perfect. Thank you all very much for your time.